I see happen a lot is a focus on the channel or the brand of the channel, Twitter, Telegram, Discord. Like these are tools rather than the audience, right?
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Katie Butler, co-founder of Distractive, a major marketing contributor to Moonbeam. And Moonbeam is a smart contract platform that lets developers build decentralized applications that integrate across many blockchains. Katie, it's so amazing to chat with you, not only because of obviously the unconventional structure of your company and its relationship to Moonbeam. And really, it's exciting. I know you kind of explained it to me a little bit before show, but I'd love for you to unpack it to the audience. But also your experience as in marketing and the new and interesting channels that I think Web3 is introducing to how kind of gaining an audience, building community, and being kind of directly connected with your consumer is just so different now. But before we get into Moonbeam, Distractive, what were you doing before this?
It's hard to remember a time before crypto. So let's see. I mean, my career has mostly been B2B startup marketing tech. So that's the easiest way to describe it. For years, I billed myself as like the marketing chameleon because I was constantly bouncing into new industries, not because I really wanted to, but because I just never really found a home. And the closest thing I found to something that I loved was marketing to developers, which is, I'm not a technical person. I don't have a CS degree. Like that's not a path that I ever imagined I would take. But I found that marketing to developers is super fun. They say they hate marketing, but really they just hate bad marketing.
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree that we do. They're just a little more vocal about it. But if
Yeah.
you can sort of earn their trust and provide value, they're really brand loyal and really fun to work with and to market to. So I just fell in love with that. And that's sort of how I ended up in the crypto space anyway.
Yeah, it's you said two words there that I think always are worth kind of extracting a little bit more of meaning, which is building trust and offering value. When you describe trust to these communities, how do you build that trust? Is it with educational content, kind of free giveaways? Is it kind of being a part of the building process and taking their feedback and incorporating it? How is their community a little bit different than the communities, and what is that trust process like?
I mean, I can't speak to the only way to do this, but I can tell you for Moonbeam, we did what we said we were going to do again and again and again. And that is the only way that we knew how to build trust, I would say. Like we were competent and knew what we were doing and why, and executed as timely as we could, given how fast everything moves in crypto and all of the other sort of things that were circling around us. So that was how we built trust. That's how we continue to build trust, is not only are we continuing to invest back into Moonbeam, both sort of like from a budget perspective, but also from a time perspective, from a technology perspective, but we're continuing to like push on what Moonbeam is capable of, what Moonbeam can do for builders, for people who want to kind of create the next generation of applications in this space. So for us, that was it, like just being reliable and being visible.
Yeah, yeah. Before we slip too deep into Moonbeam and Distractive, and just to focus a little bit more on yourself, seeing that just the changes in not only consumer behaviors, but in what's been attractive and what channels have been more attractive to the types of consumers, where do you see a lot of companies, I guess, misdirected? Because like you said, there's not great marketing campaigns or strategies, and then there's good ones. What dictates that? Obviously, it's the trust and value, but where are companies mainly missing?
So it's tough because a lot of this, I think, is a shared struggle across all kinds of companies in many different industries. I don't think this is unique to us, but what I see happen a lot is a focus on the channel or the brand of the channel. So Twitter, Telegram, Discord, like these are tools rather than the audience, right? So if we have a message that we know is really only something our very technical user base cares about, not all of our users, and certainly not everyone who follows us on Twitter, then yeah, we could distribute that message on Twitter, but it would be better to find a way to get it just in front of those users who care the most. And so starting to take like marketing 101 and apply it to what we do from a crypto perspective when we're so used to moving like fast and loose and doing everything as
Yeah.
quickly as we possibly can, but starting to implement some of these best practices in terms of segmentation and targeting your messages. Like that's where I've seen the big shift in the way that teams operate in this space. And I'm very optimistic about everyone always looks to like, what can the crypto space, what can the blockchain space do to be ready for mainstream or to get more mainstream adoption? And like what I see happening right now across the industry are like the return to fundamentals that we've all needed to take in order to like earn those users, to earn their
Yeah.
trust, to earn their attention. So I think those are the things that I see happen the most is that people are like, we'll blast it out on Twitter. And it's like, well, if you know only maybe 40 people are going to care about this, why don't you get in front of those 40 people first and then we'll see how we look at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, now it seems so cutting edge to really even more double down and focus on a small cohort of users or a small community and really kind of organically grow it. And what do you feel has caused that shift for a lot of companies or even your company in particular?
Well, everybody left in terms of like the community, right? And I don't mean like in terms of any community in particular. It's this natural contraction we see every time there's like a bear cycle here, right? So everyone kind of goes back to what they think is safe, where they want to park their assets for some time, and they return when there's seemingly more activity, more going on, new projects coming out. And so when you see things like that, it's almost like you have to really be thoughtful about what you work on in a way that you didn't before. So in 2021, for most teams, anything you touched was gold, right? Like you put out any message about any product and people were interested. They were actively looking for that kind of information in a way that a lot of community members aren't today, because they're kind of waiting until they think that something's really starting to brew. And then they'll kind of hop back into being active users on the day-to-day. So I think that is really the number one lesson, but also the difference that we need to keep in mind when we're acting for or interacting with community members is that like what they're looking for, what their expectations are, it's changed. And we need to adapt to that and understand like how our relationship with them
Yeah.
should change as well.
Yeah. You think about the channels that a lot of the marketing is done through. It seems like Discord is kind of favorite, Twitter, like crypto Twitter and all these, the ones we commonly hear. But how do you see any kind of incumbent or not incumbent, excuse me, any new generational product that's having a little bit more of a crypto forward audience now that things are a little bit more constrained and those who are involved are whether they're enthusiasts, evangelists, or what have you, but they have some stake in it. Do you see any new channels emerge?
I mean, we're certainly keeping an eye out, especially with sort of all the ruckus at Twitter. There's a lot of Twitter competitors who have popped up. I'm sort of cautiously watching and seeing what we think is going to be the winner, if there is one coming out of that. But largely, I mean, there's a few differences for me. Twitter, of course, is huge in a way that in my B2B past, Twitter was not as much of a presence in those roles, at least for me. And then Discord and Telegram, you've mentioned. I think for gamers who are interested in crypto as well, Discord in particular is sort of a sweet spot. Reddit, I think everyone knows from like a crypto speculation standpoint that audience has always been active on Reddit. But again, like in the past, from a B2B perspective, it's been hard to have a presence on Reddit. But here in this industry, like you have information that people are actively looking for. And so you are able to take advantage of those kinds of channels in a way that you wouldn't. We are keeping an eye on like Threads and Blue Sky and Mastodon and all of these new platforms that have popped up. But, from a marketing perspective, your number one consideration is really audience. And so while we don't necessarily want to wait and miss any sort of first mover advantage of getting onto these platforms early, we also don't want to go to vacant platforms.
Yeah.
So we're sort of waiting to see what happens when the dust settles before really kind of picking our horse in this battle.
Yeah. Yeah. And shifting our focus to Distractive and Moonbeam, describe the relationship between the two companies and what's particularly exciting about how you structured it. Because I thought that was extremely fascinating based on the execution of the thesis that was set out by Moonbeam. So yeah, we'd love for you to share with audience.
Yeah. So for folks who are new to Moonbeam, so Moonbeam's a smart contract platform. We were one of the first, if not the first, to really focus on taking this concept of an EVM and putting it on a modern framework on a modern technology, which for us was Substrate, which is what Polkadot's built on. So the whole idea was like, hey, how can you move the technology forward, create something net new while still kind of conforming to what people use every day in terms of tooling and languages and accounts and so forth. And so that's what we did. And we started it late 2019, early 2020. And so in the years that we were building and then of course launched in 2022, we always had an eye to decentralization. That's something that was always important to us. I used to, when I would hire pitch people, that this will probably be the first job you have, that if you're successful, you will work yourself out of a job. Like, it's just a very strange dynamic for people who aren't used to this space. But that's what we're all trying to do, right? You're building a technology, a platform. It's meant to be decentralized. It's meant to be open. And so you kind of have to go in being okay with the idea that at some point, like, you become less important. You need to really involve as many people as possible in these key decisions. And so that's something that was always important. As soon as we launched, of course, with Polkadot, we had on-chain governance built in, which was something we took advantage of from the beginning, right? That's how you launch a chain in Polkadot. And so we have always had that sort of mentality built into everything that we do. As we progressed through our kind of first year last year, we were trying to figure out like ways that we could continue that decentralization path. And so one of the things that seemed to make sense is like, at least for marketing and business development, to break it out into a separate entity. And now we have formed a separate marketing agency called Distractive, which is distractive.xyz for those who want to look us up.
Mhm.
So this is currently the marketing and business development contributor to Moonbeam, to the Moonbeam Foundation. There's also other contributors. There's now like 5 or 6 that all are contributing independently to Moonbeam. So the way that I describe it to people who are totally new to this kind of concept is it's almost the opposite of what you see in your typical business structure, right? Like where normally you have a company and that company might have many product lines. This is flipped. You have a product, which is the network, and they have many companies working on it. And so there's not like an ownership relationship there, but you have sort of many different departments all kind of working in what I call like a school of fish, right? You're all kind of generally going in the same direction. You have like a loose closeness, but you're not necessarily driven by the same prerogative that you might be under like one corporate umbrella.
Yeah. And so how does this change how you measure success as an agency?
Well, I mean, we're 2.5 months into this agency thing, so let me get back to you. But I would say from my perspective, it's tough, right? Like it's tough to go from being the primary contributors to a project to being like one of many and figuring out how to work with all of these new teams and how to make room for new ideas, new processes, some of which are good, some of which are very different from what we've done before. So I think it takes some adjustment, but for marketing, it's actually a little bit easier because as marketers, we work with agencies all the time. Like you'd be hard pressed to find a marketer who hasn't hired a branding agency or a PR agency or a website design agency or something in the past. And so we have those experiences to draw upon. It's a little bit different for some of my colleagues who've pursued similar kinds of projects where they are working on like operational entities or developer relation entities, and their agency relationship experience is just a little bit different. So they may have different working relationships. But for me, I have a lot to learn from and copy from in my past experiences. So we're just trying to adopt things that I've liked when I've worked with some really nice agencies in the past.
Yeah. Do most foundations have kind of an arm like yours that kind of focuses on building that community, or do they typically build it inside? How different is this from what we usually see other foundations structured?
I mean, to some degree, it's different.
Or similar?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like this is sort of forging a new path. And so there's many teams
Mm.
that I've seen sort of do similar things. I know like the Osmosis team is similarly decentralized. There's a lot of different contributors to Osmosis. I believe that I'm trying to, well, I won't name any names unless I'm sure, but there's a bunch of other teams that have sort of pursued something like this. And I don't know as much about like how many of them started out being like just a couple of teams, 1 or 2, and then broke into many. But I think generally speaking, what we're seeing is like there's basically two parties here. Teams that are serious about decentralization and teams that are like decentralization theater in some ways. And so for us, like we're trying to just take it one step at a time and do what we think is like right for the ecosystem. And for me, that means like actively working and finding other contributors who can come join and chip into what we're doing, other vendors, other parties who can be involved with Moonbeam long term. So I don't have a clean answer to your question. I think there's a lot of different models for how people have chosen to do this. To some degree, there's some similarities, but
Yeah.
by and large, like we're doing something that not that many people have tried before. So there's just not a clear consensus on the right way to do it yet.
Yeah. What are some, I guess, kind of crucial decisions that you've had to kind of fall into, being that this is so different and so dynamic, and really like it's so reliant, that trust is, I couldn't imagine having such a reliance on that trust building within the community. Have there been anything that's just out of the ordinary that you've not seen in your career before, just within this new ecosystem?
So many things. I mean, I think Polkadot in their own right were one of the first to do an on-chain vote about their rebrand, which I think is pretty significant. I don't remember if it was 2020 or 2021, but a few years ago they did a pretty big rebrand project. And so like that was, I think, the first time I've ever seen anything like that go on chain. And so for me, that was, I would say, the true first. For Moonbeam, most of the decisions that happen for Moonbeam are quite technical. And so some of the things that we're working to make sure are easier for users to take advantage of would be things like delegation, which has always been present on Moonbeam, but we want more users to be able to tap into that so they don't have to worry about the minutia of like these channel openings and some of the smaller things that maybe don't impact them day to day, but they do still have and want visibility for big things that are happening, like grant distribution, for example. So there's these ecosystem grant funds subsidized by the Moonbeam Foundation, and the community gets a direct say in how they're allocated. And so we've seen that not only do community members really want to participate in those, they're very vocal about them. And they're kind of excited about seeing these grants be put back into the ecosystem and being able to have a say in that. And I think that's something that you just don't see in a lot of places. Like when I first was working in this space, I was constantly struck by how many people wanted to find out about what I was doing versus, again, like
Yeah.
products I've sold in the past, you end up feeling like you're pitching people all the time. Whereas this is the inverse, right? People are knocking at your door. They want to know what you're up to. And so this was similar where so many people wanted to participate in the grant process. It was refreshing. It was nice to see.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been exciting, obviously, the company's in terms of the structure is a little bit newer, but what's been exciting about the traction you've seen up till now, and what are you particularly focused on, and as the next month and the next year's goal and agenda come up?
So I think Moonbeam launched at the beginning of 2022, and 2022 was a wild year in this industry. So it's kind of crazy to see how many things have changed in the last year and a half since we've been live. I would say we've always had like very good adoption on the dApp side. So we were the biggest and the first ecosystem in the Polkadot space. And that for us was always sort of our pride point, right? It was the easiest place to build. It's where everyone wanted to be. It's where the users wanted to be. And that excitement, I think, really helped propel us to where we are. Last year, we really shifted to say, okay, how can we move things forward exponentially, right? Because we're seeing a lot of, and I'm sure you've seen this too in this space, like kind of copying and pasting, like, oh, well, what if we did this app, but for this ecosystem, or did this app for this ecosystem? And so you just don't end up with total rethinking of the way that you approach things. And so that's what we were trying to do last year. And the founder introduced this concept of connected contracts, right? So this is the idea that you can have many different networks kind of behind the scenes, all coordinating to produce an application experience for end users that looks and feels nice and normal. And you don't have to
Yeah.
worry about bouncing from space to space to space. And so for us, this is where we've spent a lot of our time, and we've seen some traction here. Particularly, there's one team that launched recently called Prime Protocol. And so they've kind of really changed the game in terms of what a Web3 based application can look like. And that's the kind of thing that I get really bullish about, right? That's where you can see, all right, so we're not trying to say, hey, we're just going to pester users until they really want to participate in this ugly, difficult to use, not very appealing application. It's instead flipping it on its head and saying, let's make it way easier to use so that we are worthy of their attention and that we can present something to them that meets their basic expectations. And so I'm very, very excited to see this technology really continue to be adopted. There's a few other teams who have some interesting stuff in the works that I don't think I can talk about yet. But those kinds of use cases are what I get very excited about.
Yeah. And how's it structured? So you get a project that has some momentum, some validity, and then your goal is to make sure that there's a lot of activity going on that project. People know about it, people are educated on it, and maybe even get involved. And then are you deploying resources to that? What is your like main responsibility in how you manage the growth of a lot of these different projects? Because it seems like at some point there's going to be so many.
Hundreds. That's always, I think, the trick. So the Moonbeam network is neutral, right? The network is something that is supportive of all chains that deploy to it. But that's actually one of the advantages of now becoming our own entity as Distractive, is that as Moonbeam and as a contributing team to Moonbeam, we have a set of guidelines and we have to follow those guidelines, right? You have to be live. You have to be clear about what you provide as an end user experience. You have to have a thing to announce or some news to share. And so those sorts of support pieces make sense when you're first launching. But on a go forward basis, as you're trying to acquire users, like it becomes really hard to just keep using Moonbeam resources in order to get in front of net new users. But as Distractive, as an independent marketing entity, we have a little bit more autonomy. And so we haven't done this at all yet. But in the future, if this is something we decide to do, we have the ability to say, all right, I think like this application could be really interesting for us to work with directly. Why don't we work on their own marketing channels to grow those marketing channels separately and independently from Moonbeam? Obviously, as a Moonbeam contributor, there's going to be like some overlap in that audience. But what we see is like not a lot of teams who have the ability or the resources to invest back in their own marketing. And that's the real game changer rather than marketing serving as a general resource for 300 projects.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to kind of identify and qualify the projects that are have the right recipe to work on it or not have those resources. And it is exciting to think about what those resources deployed looks like being as an individual entity and the flexibility that you have. Like I would assume the speed at which you can deploy different tests and actually get different consumer feedback must be just exponentially faster if you had a separate satellite entity versus internally. Do you see that deployment increased?
And not yet, maybe.
Nah.
I would say like right now, we're still pretty small. There's like 6 of us. So we are sort of getting to the point where we're starting to be able to choose resources that we think will really be able to help speed up some of the things that we want to work on. But at least for now, I wouldn't say that like the separation of the entity is really added speed. If anything, there's redundancy now, right? There's multiple decision makers involved in many different kinds of things. And so I think that some of that stuff will need to kind of figure out a new working relationship in order to then gain speed down the road.
Yeah, yeah. What do you view as some of the biggest challenges that Distractive and Moonbeam faces today, outside of obviously the external market, but whether it's internal or external companies? What do you view?
I mean, focus and knowing what we're good at, those are the hardest things to do from a marketing perspective, right? And not because we're incapable, but because you want to do so many things. You want to say yes to so many projects. You have a constant like barrage of requests for things that need your support. And so it sort of requires going back to if you've ever done like a lean startup exercise where you're trying to figure out not only your positioning, but what are your core competencies? Like if you had just one channel to pick to put all of your energy into, what is it? And so the ups and downs of crypto create this like swelling and then contracting. And we have to remember to contract, right? Like this is a good opportunity to say, hey, I don't know if this activity is really producing what we hoped it would. Maybe we put that on the back burner until we have more capacity to deal with that. So I think focus from a marketing perspective, focus from a Moonbeam perspective too, right? What is Moonbeam best at? What is Moonbeam known for? those are all super important. And this is a great time to work on some of that so that we're really like clean operationally as we move into the fall.
Yeah. And if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision?
For Distractive or for Moonbeam? Oh, I don't know. Distractive, we've pondered so many different kinds of ideas. I think our first prerogative is like reinvestment back into Moonbeam, right? Like we have been here since the beginning. We're very enthusiastic about Moonbeam and its ecosystem, all the things that we're seeing happening, all of the projects that are coming in, the continual, like, I don't know how to describe how impressive the founders are in this space. Like there's so many people that I think are just really interesting. And so with that, like putting more time back into Moonbeam is probably where Distractive will spend its time. For Moonbeam itself, again, like I think there's a few interesting things that we're working on from a marketing perspective. The first is like a brand refresh. We have, I think, components of a brand that we really like and people respond well to, but we've never had a designer. We're always kind of scrappy. And so I'd like to sort of have a more comprehensive approach to branding, including who we are and what is our brand identity.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think we're working on right now. That will result in hopefully a new website. And that hopefully will be followed by sort of a bigger push into Moonbeam so that people can really start to understand what it is that we do beyond like being a developer platform. What is it that makes Moonbeam special?
Yeah. I love this next section. I call it my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we get. So my first question I would like to open it up with is what's particularly hard about your job day to day?
Oh, remembering to sign off my computer before midnight. I'd say like there's the first biggest thing is that marketing is in many ways the last stop for every internal and external team before projects are launched. And so what ends up happening is that where you might have a roadmap in like a more corporate company, here we don't. And so it's a bunch of teams with conflicting timelines not talking to each other. So for me, marketing is in some ways the one who has to point these things out. And it can be challenging, right? Like, hey, team one, talk to team two. Like you guys are both trying to do the same thing at the same time to the same audience. Like you got to work it out. And so that I think is sort of persistently the biggest challenge, as well as just making sure that we're not forgetting that at the end of our day, at the end of the day here, like our job is only done if we continue to bring our industry up a level. And so it's really easy to continue focusing only on people who are already in this space, who already have an interest in crypto and in blockchain. But we need to kind of like pause every once in a while and say like, hey, weren't we supposed to be bringing this to like a broader set of users? Why don't we think about that more seriously? So those are kind of where I kind of waver back and forth from a challenge perspective.
Yeah. When you're thinking about broadening your users, how much of that relies on just foundationally the core story of the product or brand? I'm thinking about currently I'm launching a product, and one challenging bit is how does the story of the product or brand impact the content or the campaigns or everything that surrounds that? It's I don't know. It seems so vague and ambiguous. So for me, at least, it's challenging to make it make all sense. What would you recommend for founders going through something similar to myself, or even with Moonbeam being that a lot of the products are new? How do you build a story and then create content to actually and reinforce that story?
It's marketing, right? Like it's sort of like everything that marketing does from an integrated perspective when you're trying to like live and breathe your brand identity. Ideally, like the big test is if you can put something out there and forget to put your logo on it and people still know who it is, either because of your voice or because of your visuals or because of the way that you're approaching things, whatever it is, all of it, preferably. If they can still figure out who it is, then you have like a pretty good brand, right? You're doing things consistently. You have that. I think a lot of it depends on who you're working with and what your company looks like. Like I've worked at companies that are very, very open to having a unique, powerful voice when it comes to branding. And I've worked at companies that prefer to just be very literal and benign and a little bit tame when it comes to voice. I've worked at companies that like to be tame when it comes to visual branding, but are okay being loud from a visual branding perspective and having a neon logo. So it really depends on sort of what you're doing, but consistently across everything that you do from a communication standpoint, that's really all you can do is like define a path, hopefully a unique one that speaks to you, one that speaks to your users, and then just implement it regularly and consistently.
And what are the different components to defining that path? Is it having values, a set of words that you should relate your product and your brand should be, say, fun and joyful, light? How do you define it?
I have so many fun brand positioning exercises. I love doing them. So the first is, what is it that you do for your users, right? What's your reason to be? What is it that continues to bring like that uniqueness to your brand? That's your identity, right? Like, what is the thing that you offer? And I don't mean literally. I mean, like, what is the spirit behind what you offer? And then you kind of want to work backwards to, why do you do that? And who is it for? And what's the actual offering? And so where, especially in the technology space, many people tend to get tripped up is describing what they do without describing why they do it. And that's really a distinction that is super important, right? So that's a key component. I do typically go through a lot of exercises around what are the adjectives we use to describe it. Who are we? And more importantly, who are we not? How do we talk and how do we not talk? So one thing that I've been a stickler in a previous life in enforcing is like, we claimed our brand spirit was all about like empowering developers to fix their own code from a security perspective.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, we use things that were kind of condescending in our language. Like, well, by the end of this, you should be able to do this. Instead of like, hey, learn more about whatever it is that we're about to teach you. You should understand. And so it's kind of subtle things, but making sure that developers are incredibly smart people. Let's not be condescending when we talk to them. Let's not be pedantic, and like making sure that our brand identity matches our voice everywhere, and go through kind of this pretty tedious exercise, but an important one. And then if you can produce like a set of documents that really outlines who you want to be and why, that's kind of your action plan.
Yeah. Have you ever had a situation with either founders or whoever is kind of responsible for like a branding project? It's just hard for them to define that. And how do you go through this exercise, you push through it? How often do you have to lean on your own kind of confidence and expertise and just trust in your ability to give them guidance in the right direction?
Yeah. I mean, I think most people will tell you, most marketers will tell you that if you don't have buy-in at the C level, it's not going to happen. It doesn't matter how well-researched or thoughtful or specific your like brand's documentation is. It's not going to happen if you can't get buy-in at the topmost level. And that can be tough, especially if depending on like the personalities that you've had. I've worked with engineering CEOs. I've worked with sales CEOs. I've worked with product CEOs. I've worked with former investor CEOs. Like, I've had a lot of different archetypes at the helm here.
Yeah.
And I would say that they all have sort of their own biases. But if you can get them bought in, that's really the biggest determination. And then you can work with, I would say, sales, if you have it, BD, ecosystem development, whatever you want to call it, in whatever industry you're in. That's going to be the number 2 place that you need to make sure this is enforced. Because if marketing sounds all flowery and delightful, then you hand things off to your sales team and it's a totally different experience, then nobody wins.
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking about your experience and what's something that you particularly has had a particularly lasting impact on you, whether it's book or people, what's something that you've taken today and actually impacts your work day to day? Anything come to mind?
Let me just look. There's one that I really liked called Contagious. And it's how ideas catch on. And that one, have you read it?
I'm like halfway through it, and it's just giving me absolute like how to maximize word of mouth and create that referral network. Like, please continue. But I'm fascinated on how to do it.
So I'm not a reader of very many marketing or business books, partially because many of these kinds of books are written for non-marketers who want to understand the concepts of marketing, right? So I've had a lot of them recommended to me, and I'm like, this is just explaining how marketing works at a very basic level. So it's not very helpful for me. But Contagious, I thought, was helpful not only professionally, but like personally, right? Understanding how different presentations and types of communication can change the way that ideas are kind of accepted. That to me was, I think, probably the most interesting and something that I reference all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good book. And I now I'm even more motivated to complete it, but it's amazing to think about how you can tie a brand with such a movement and the timing of it and incorporating all those different aspects. And I guess being that with marketing, I feel like timing is crucial. The product has to be at a certain point. You have to have some product market fit, maybe some customers, already some momentum. What are some signals that you use to define when it is the right time to deploy a campaign or test a new version of a product, a new landing page? What are those signals that you see or that you use to dictate?
So I could think two approaches. The first is if there's a low lift way to do it now, right? Like
Yeah.
just start putting it out there and testing. So for example, like if there's a way, if there's a market you want to try out, if there's a use case you want to try out and you're not sure if it's the right use case, like put out a page, talk to a couple people, have a conversation with actual users and get some feedback instead of like waiting and pondering. And if the feedback they give you is like, you need more, or now's not the time, then at least you're getting that from someone other than yourself. So that's usually the first thing I try to do. The second thing is have like a frequent open line of communication with your community lead. For us, for the longest time, marketing and community were very lockstep, right? Like they were working together very, very closely, which was in my mind, like a great advantage for marketing, right? Like we have a very good sense of what the community is thinking and feeling and seeing. They're going to be the ones who tell you when sentiment changes, when people are starting to get excited about something, maybe about something you didn't quite anticipate, when there's starting to be like renewed enthusiasm, when people are starting to kind of come back or be interested in a particular thing, they're going to be the first ones who know about it. And so making sure you have that constant open line of communication is very, very important.
Yeah, the sentiment, that's an interesting word that you chose, because I feel like that is a really interesting signal to be, but I feel like it's clear once you kind of key in and listen to it. Katie, I know we're coming to the close of the episode, so I always like to ask this question before we leave here. Actually, two more questions. One is, if you weren't doing this, what else would you be doing? Or working on this product, what other product would you be working on?
Yeah. Well, so I would say like for the first year that I was in this industry, I kept referring to like crypto as those crazy people, right? Not literally, but like I felt like an outsider. I was referring to them as sort of a separate entity. It took a good year before I felt like I was part of it. And since I've sort of like passed that, I'll never go back. I can't imagine a world where I go back to working, even like I worked in startups my whole career and they operated at a snail's pace compared to this industry. Everything is so fast moving. There's new technology exists every 3 to 4 months. And so I don't think I would leave this industry. I would probably find ways to, again, like help close that gap between what I'm seeing as someone who lives and breathes this every day versus what outsiders are seeing in terms of like actual applicable use cases and things they can interact with on a day-to-day basis. So probably application side would be my guess, but I don't know. We'll think.
Yeah. Last thing is, I know we covered a lot of things today, but is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have, anything that we left on the table here today?
Oh man, I'm not sure that I have a good. I should have thought of something in advance. I don't think there's anything that comes to mind from my kind of day-to-day point of view. I'm just really excited about some of the stuff that I think is going to be popping up here in the last half of the year. So for me, I think this is like a really interesting time because I get to work on projects that I've been wanting to work on for a long time. And I'm personally very eager to sort of work to unveil those this fall. I just don't have much for people to see for a preview yet, but hopefully this will be stuff that everyone will see very soon.
Amazing. Well, where can we find that? Where can we be not only a fan of the projects you're working on, but you and what you're working on as a professional, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, where?
There's a million channels. So Distractive.xyz is the name of the agency. And so we are today marketing and BD wholly focused on Moonbeam and the Moonbeam ecosystem. Moonbeam, you can access moonbeam.network, and there's a whole bunch of social channels you can access from the ribbon there. But we are on every channel that you've ever probably interacted with: Twitter, Telegram, Discord, Reddit, YouTube, all of the above. So you can probably our website's the easiest way to get that info.
Amazing. Katie, it's been such a pleasure not only unpacking your early career, but also what you're working on now and just the different and unique way that the company is structured and how everything is kind of impacted to pushing a product in this ecosystem forward. And it's really cool to think about what that means and changes to not only products, but consumers and this whole ecosystem. So thank you for giving us your insights and sharing about how we can also build our brands and build our brands better. I hope you enjoyed yourself today. And thank you again for being on Behind Company Lines.
Yeah, happy to be here.